took one guy to a funeral home that was prepping a 16-year-old girl the same age as his daughter. And I addressed the deceased by his daughter's name. And I said, Dad didn't have time to pay attention to what you were doing. And I said to the funeral director, so how many hours do you have invested so far with the autopsy and everything? And I said, but Dad didn't have time to listen to the counselors and listen to the rest of the family because he knew it all. So how much time is it going to take to put this funeral on? And how many people are going to take time off of work to come and pay their condolences to the father who didn't have time to save your life? And he became my best friend.
Welcome to Crime Time Inc. This is Simon MacLean, and we've got a very special guest this week, part 2 of my interview with him. This is Mike Bonventre, just outside New York, the former undercover with the Mafia. And his original podcast with us has been very, very popular with listeners, and I'm sure you'll find this one fascinating too. Here's the interview I had with Mike. How are you anyway, my friend?
I'm doing very well, very well. Was dealing with health issues for many years, and I found several alternative providers, and I'm feeling better today than I've felt in 20 years.
Is that anything to do with bullet holes, those health issues, no? Being shot by mafia hitmen or anything like that?
That's the only place I don't have any pain.
So you'd recommend
I'd recommend it highly. Get shot at least once in each limb that's not vital.
Mike, we keep in touch on social media, and I see that you're involved in some of the stuff that we do with LEAP and all that. Tell us a wee bit, other than your family history, if you like. They told us the story of your dad's business and his unfortunate engagement with the mafia who were trying to run things over there. Tell us a wee bit about your story out with that and what you're doing now, because you're very busy on social media, aren't you?
Very busy. And all this started 40 years ago. And it's something that I do on the side, not something that I concentrate on. But like everything else in the drug world, there's more business than you want. And it just keeps coming no matter what you do to get away from it. So very short story, my father had a business that was embezzled by the Italian Mafia, very famous, world-known family. And at one point, when he wasn't going to get anything back and he had really irritated them, they threatened to kill my family. And my mother accidentally recorded it because in the 1980s, we didn't have cell phones and voicemail. We had old-fashioned cassette tape recorders. So she accidentally recorded it. And I'll go back to, yes, we got embezzled, and yes, our lives got threatened, but that's what you expect from the Italian Mafia and from criminals. What we did not expect is that when I took that recording to the FBI agent informed me that they were not interested in investigating my father's $1 million loss, and they were not interested in investigating whether or not they were going to kill us. And he told me and explained to me why my family and my family's business were acceptable collateral damage in their 25-year investigation. So you expect criminals to rob you and kill you. You don't expect law enforcement to condone it and enable it. So I was 25 years old. I was a little mouthy and opinionated. And at one point, the FBI agent really got to me. And I threatened him. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but you will be unemployed, and this investigation will be interrupted before anybody kills me. And I got in the car and I looked in the rearview mirror and I smiled and I said, wow, you're impressive, you idiot. You just threatened an FBI agent. So, growing up in business, I knew these mafia people. Hi, how are you? I'm servicing your business. And just at a distance, I knew them, but we recognized each other. So I went to Florida, 1,500 miles away from where I live, where this mafia underboss was retiring. And I enlisted law enforcement in the state of Florida, the state attorney, the sheriff's department, the state police, and the Florida FBI to work with me to undermine all the law enforcement in New York, 1,500 miles north. And I found out in that moment, every department protected their own future in their own budgets, and they were happy to help me undermine their counterparts 1,500 miles away because it was in their interest and their budgets. So I used my business experience. I went to the mafia boss's house and I convinced him that his friends in New York robbed my father for $2.5 million, not the truth, $1 million. So I convinced him that we had mutual enemies and that I could get my father's $2.5 million back, and I could get him the $1.5 million that his people cheated him out of. And I don't know if he believed me or that I was convincing and his greed would not ignore my claims. So he took me in under his wing. I convinced him that I could take over all of his business interests, hundreds of businesses, and make them profitable enough that he could continue to rob them without putting them into bankruptcy or out of business.
Just picking up the nuances of what you're saying there, because I've got a constant struggle that we have. Just to bring you up to speed, I formed Elite Branch here in Scotland 3 years ago when my book came out, and I found some like-minded people who believed not what I believe, what I know to be fact, that through our actions in the UK since 1971, utilising the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971 as our major tool against drug importation and supply and use here in the UK, not only have we perpetuated the problem and accentuated the problem, but we created the problem. We created the market that allowed criminals to flourish because it's totally unregulated. And as soon as anyone enters that market, we class them as criminal and therefore ostracize them and negate any chance that they had of help or pointing in the right direction, or that they're criminals. End of. So I'm preaching to converted when I say that, but it's to put it into context. Because I also believe, I'm not speaking for anyone else here but myself, that part of the issue here is vested interests. One of those vested interests is the police, because I was a detective, and everybody knows that the best leverage that you can get is when you've got a person who's dependent on drugs in custody, who can't source drugs, not in a police station. They can soon source it when they get to prison. That's another issue altogether. But they're strung out, for want of a better phrase, desperate for drugs. We used to say they would shop their granny. That means they would inform on their grandmother in order to source drugs at that stage. So that's great leverage for a detective to have. Whatever the crime is that he's investigating within that community, whether it's car theft, whether it's assault, murder, doesn't matter. Information is what you want, and you've got the guy by the short and curlies because you've cut off his supply line by having him in custody. You're the most important person in the whole world to him at that point because you can liberate him if he gives you the right information that you're looking for. So I'm preaching to converted with that as well. What you're talking about here is much wider vested interests. Like an FBI investigation going on for 25 years, that's a career. In the police force, that's a career, 25 years.
That was this FBI agent's message to me, is that there's a big investment of time, money, manpower, information, but where he got me personally upset was when he told me my family's lives didn't matter and he wasn't going to allow me to upset his wonderful 25-year career and his wife's career and his children's security. Basically saying I'm more important than the taxpayer who's paying my salary.
And all the other detectives or FBI agents that are involved all the way down the tree. And that's just one guy, that's just one family, one criminal enterprise of hundreds of
Right.
thousands.
And what I really came to realize during my undercover days is, let's say, just for an example, there's 200 police officers in a department. There's two crooked, corrupt, no good cops, but there's 198 that are forbidden to expose them. The code of blue, the honor all cops no matter what, never admit that there's 2 out of 200 that are bad. So they seemed to be as frustrated as I was, but I was an independent citizen. They would have lost their jobs, their pensions, and their reputations if they did what was in their heart to do and what they signed up to do. So I don't think there's that many bad cops. I think there's a really bad system that doesn't allow 198 good cops to expose and eliminate the 2 bad ones.
Let me expand that a wee bit then, because you're talking here about 2 bad apples who are probably on the take in an early stage in their career, probably saw the potential to do that and to make money and whatever their motives were, probably cash. So they become corrupted and very quickly they can never get out of that because of the information and intelligence that they've passed. They could be dead for all intents and purposes because they can never escape that now. All the information and all the blackmail that's going on, their lives are trashed from then on. So let's look at the other 198 because I've got a colleague actually who works in this field and he calls this standby syndrome. It's when you don't do anything.
Right.
It's when you know what's going on, but rather than get involved and say something, you do nothing.
And there's little incentive to do something.
No, it's all negative. It's all negative. But that filters down not from major crime that you're talking about with mafia and whatnot, but it filters right down to the other end of the scale where just misogyny's involved, or where the racism's involved, or any kind of attitude displayed by a police officer in his position that's unacceptable to society and to us. And it might seem much more trivial than what we're talking about here, but the same turn the blind eye syndrome still applies, that things won't change as long as the 198 do nothing.
Well, also, you have to figure that racism and bigotry and bullying fit in to the profit. So when I approached this mafia guy, he knew that I had been in contact with law enforcement. But he took me in anyways, saying, I like you, you're defending your father's honor, and I own the FBI in Florida the same as I do in New York. I have been successful for 25 years because I give them all my competition to make them look good. So he basically was buying his protection from law enforcement because when his competition got in his way, he would turn law enforcement onto them. They would get a great publicity news flash, and then their budgets would get bigger and bigger, and they would hire more cops and get better equipment because they could prove that there was a lot of criminals out there. Only because of the help of this criminal who got there first. I'll tell you an example of a police chief that I forced to retire. He wasn't a bad guy. He was a young guy who probably rented a movie on Friday night and smoked 1 joint a week. But he bought 1 joint for $5 from a huge gang member. who now blackmailed him and said, I will expose you for using drugs. I will ruin your career. I'll destroy everything you've worked for unless you start arresting my competition. And in the meantime, this police chief became a hero, just newsworthy every day, making huge busts. But he was working for the drug dealer who sold him $5 worth of pot. Now, when they ran out of competition, the drug dealer convinced him any future arrest, I get half the drugs and half the money, you'll still look good. Just claim you found 5 pounds of cocaine, not 10. Just claim you found $5,000, not 10. And then when that started to go awry, he actually pressured this police chief into stealing evidence from the evidence room. Now, there was a big, long investigation, but, politics was involved, and there were a lot of other law enforcement people, judges, and lawyers that were involved on a higher level. So that investigation was never going to come to an end. And people were calling me from the inside, giving me all this information. Law enforcement, the good cops, the 198, became my informants because they couldn't do anything without losing their jobs, but they knew I wasn't one of them and nobody was going to fire me. So I called the police chief to my office. I explained to him everything that I had on him and that I was going to go on social media tomorrow night and expose him to the public if he didn't resign. 9 o'clock the next morning, he didn't even show up for work. They had to find him to find out that he was resigning. he was so scared.
Were you not concerned about your own safety during that period?
No, because I did everything in my name and I was very open, and I had, like I believe a lot of politicians today, I had so much dirt on so many important people that the people who wanted to kill me probably didn't want to, probably protected me because they were afraid if I died or got hurt that I would tell everything. So that was my protection. My knowledge of all the real dirt on a governor, on assemblymen, on congressmen, on judges was my protection. The criminals loved me because I was public. So if they saw my Facebook that I was going to attack a street tomorrow night, they would just move everybody out and protect themselves. So they didn't want to see any harm come to me.
Mike, I quite often say in things that I write and people I talk to, I quite often have a throwaway line that the war on drugs and the consequences of it, the fortunes that are being earned by cartels, I use that word lightly, of course, that are being raked in by the cartels and organised crime. These funds are so vast that they now undermine our very institutions, our democracy. And I kind of throw that line away and I never go into it in any detail because it's almost too horrific for us to think about. But what you're telling us here at every turn is that that's exactly what's going on in the criminal world. Because once these people, these criminals earn, there I go again, once they have access to sufficient funds, they then have influence. And they can then become respectable. They can become lords and ladies, and they're very, very wealthy. And as we know, money talks. And they can change people's lives at the stroke of a pen by transferring X amount of money. And the funds that are available in the marketplace that we're talking about has that kind of life-changing effect for many. So am I not exaggerating when I say that we're undermining our institutions?
No,
Remembering that we're usually 10 years behind the state.
not at all. I was befriended by a former DEA agent, Michael Levine, world famous. He's on all the talk shows. He's an expert witness, and he was in several of the United States' largest undercover drug operations with cartels. And at each stage, Washington called and said, stop what you're doing. We don't make money winning the war on drugs. We make money fighting the war on drugs. And I'll give you one specific that I have a tape of Mike Levine on my website sitting down with a Mexican general agreeing to pay him $1 million to make sure drugs came into the United States every month. Ed Meese, our attorney general at that time, called the Mexican attorney general and blew Mike Levine's cover while he was dealing with the Mexican military. He barely got out with his life, and when he went to Washington, he said, Ed, what are you doing? And he said, Mike, let the drugs flow into the United States. We're trying to pass NAFTA. We can't shut down the Mexican drug cartels right now because it will destroy our free trade agreement. So we had to shut you down to protect NAFTA.
Tell me what NAFTA is, Mike.
NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's the agreement we make with every other country to import and export goods and make money with. So that's the agreement that we have with China to make chips and certain automobiles. Where I live, we have the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes, which has more salt than we'll ever need on this planet. But because of NAFTA, we have to pay an absorbent amount of money to get it shipped in from South America because of our trade agreement. We'll buy your salt, not use our own for a third of the price, if you allow us to do X, Y, or Z. So it's all a financial negotiation. I've always said that the war on drugs was a brilliant business plan, a $1 trillion profit center, never intended to win and never intended to be successful. Success would have destroyed trillions of dollars. The war on drugs was the biggest farce that I can imagine after 40 years of being a business consultant. I just think the war on drugs was brilliant if you were interested in money and job security and manipulating politics.
And racism and marginalizing people and controlling people. The way we talk about it sometimes, not me, but I've heard it spoken about, and I don't have expertise in this field, but I've read about it and I've spoken to people about it, and it all goes back to Nixon in 1970. And we now know through his advisors and whatnot over the years who've come out and told the truth about it, that it was really about getting control of blacks in the South because they were having festivals and smoking pot, and they were actually having the cheek to have relationships with white women. And that was totally unacceptable to them at that time. We're going back 50 years, 54 years, of course. And so they had to have some way of controlling these people. And the perfect plan, as you say, money was behind it, of course, but the perfect plan was to make the drugs that they were using illegal. And then we could lock them all up and make them criminals. And that puts them on the other side of the fence.
Well, and that also brings up back in the day when AIDS was new, just let all the gays die of AIDS, not thinking that there might be a married guy who's gay in the closet who might be sleeping with your wife and give you AIDS. So they just associated AIDS with gays and let it run rampant. We'll get rid of all the gays. We'll get rid of all the blacks. Prohibition in the United States back in the 1920s just created a beautiful cash flow market for the underground. And it's that old saying throughout life, tell us we can't have something, we'll pay 10 times more to get it. So prohibition could be beneficial if implemented properly, but there's no 100% this and 100% that. There's always a middle ground that has to be considered.
And what we have here is a marketplace, of course.
Well, sure.
And it's subject to the rules of the marketplace, the universal rules of supply and demand. And as soon as we said you can't have that, we handed it to the black marketeers. I posted a thing last night on Twitter and it's had quite a bit of traction because I was looking at prohibition and I could have gone on all night, but I was looking at books that were banned, Mike, like J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter was banned. That guaranteed that it was going to be a
That's
bestseller.
right.
The Da Vinci Code was banned because of religious undertones. These books became films, became major cash cows for one simple reason: we banned them. We banned a group here in the UK back in the 70s called the Sex Pistols because they brought out a single called God Save the Queen, and it was a punk track about anarchy. And we banned it immediately. And it went to number one immediately.
Yeah, and it inspired more of the same. That's the tragedy in everything we think about is we put profit before common sense. The intention may have started out good, but the profit always takes over and controls the initial good meaning. Now, when LEAP started in the US, it was law enforcement against prohibition.
Yes.
And then it evolved. So you made a comment that we're about 10 years ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
I was dealing with LEAP 15 years ago when it was going through its
Okay.
growing stages and evolving. Always consider your country and my country. What might work in your country probably won't work in my country because of the overwhelming greed and the many decades of it reaching the top echelon levels of our government. So when I was undercover, I had police chiefs calling me and tipping me off. I had judges calling me and tipping me off. I had a governor calling me to negotiate some things. I had a lot of very high, important friends when they thought I was a criminal. I have no friends now that I'm out. I dealt with hundreds of millions of dollars during my 3 years undercover. And when I came home, I drove home in a ratty old Chevy Nova with about $500 in my pocket. I could have stashed away hundreds of thousands. I was always afraid that law enforcement would set me up to be the criminal and say that I profited from them. So when I came home after 3 years of dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars, I came home literally with $500 in my pocket and a half broken down car because I was worried about my image and my legacy and how I could be entrapped and set up.
We've painted a pretty bleak picture here where the criminals, basically, who are millionaires now that have been involved in the drugs market for any length of time, they rule the roost. They're probably above the law to some degree now because they don't have to go near the coalface, if you like. They never have to go near drugs. They've got systems set up to deal with that. They've got a whole HR department dealing with that, of recruitment. And there's no end of supply of willing donkeys to carry out the bread and butter functions of drug supply. So that's a pretty bleak picture. They've also infiltrated our criminal justice system, our systems of local and federal, for you, government, and our police forces, our judges, our lawyers, because they're all susceptible to the king of cash. So that's a pretty bleak picture, mate. Let's just finish off on the LEAP side then. Did you have involvement with LEAP in the States? Did they have that self-awareness that you're talking about?
They contacted me on a couple of occasions, but we were so far apart in our ideologies. I was willing to talk and reason and share my experiences. They were asking me questions only to get the answers they wanted at that time. So no matter what I did and what my intentions were and what my motives were, I was an informant. And whether I volunteered or I was just a criminal trying to save my neck, to law enforcement back at that time, informants were scum. It didn't matter what your reason was. So in the early days of LEAP in the United States, I didn't see a change from the motives of greed and survival and situational ethics. As long as it benefits us, we'll find that it's somewhat ethical. So it has evolved. It has evolved. And, this is not at all bleak. I'm just a citizen. I'm not a karate kung fu guy. I don't carry guns. I just don't allow myself to be bullied by the people whose salaries I pay with my taxes. And if we could just educate people, citizens, drug cartels are scared to death that United States citizens will develop a backbone. They're not worried about law enforcement and politics. They can purchase those, but you cannot purchase pride, self respect, and determination. So, if you want a positive note, in the US, we have 400 million citizens. Can you imagine if 10 million got behind me? Now, I have a lot of supporters, police officers, over 150 police officers that support me privately, anonymously, scared to death that they'll lose their jobs. So when I go on TV or on the news and I complain, I have a ghost army. There's nothing to back me up other than what I claim I'm being told. So, as one person, I am one of the most powerful people in the United States. I tell governors where to get off, I tell police chiefs where to get off, and nobody bothers me. So, why is everybody I talk to so afraid to be honest and speak up? Go to any coffee shop, any cafe, and you'll find out everything you need to know about corruption. Get a news camera in front of you, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil.
It's very interesting, Mike, because I do talks to all sorts of any organisation that will have me, basically, and especially if they feed me as well, if they give me a bite of lunch or breakfast or whatever. But I generally speak, and there's generally maybe 30, 40, sometimes 50 people there if it's an evening function. And I start it off by asking for a show of hands for everyone who believes that enforcement, prohibition, and our current drug laws, we need more policemen, we need more enforcement on the streets, if that's the way to tackle the drugs problem. And we used to get about 90% of the room would put their hand up at that point, because it's usually a very conservative audience, remember, that have invited me to come and speak to them. But within 15 or 20 minutes of speaking, I take the vote again and it's switched entirely on its head. And you're lucky if there's two or three still of that opinion. And they don't really know why they are, other than they just think they should be politically. So what you're saying is absolutely true. But those people go away after I've spoke to them and forget all about it, because we don't really have a vehicle for them to mobilise their opinion other than the ballot box. We've just had a general election. But this isn't even an issue in the general election. We're too busy dealing with the big economic and education and those kind of foreign policy, that kind of issue. Although you and I frustratingly know that this undermines all of that at the end of the day, undermines everything, because the amount of cash that's flowing can buy anything these guys want. And they've got no positive motives for doing this at all. It's all about power and cash, isn't it, at the end of the day?
It is. I do a lot of talks like you. We have what's called civic organizations, the Kiwanis, the Lions, the Elks, and they're usually like your crowd, 30, 40 people. They get together every month and they have a different speaker. And I start out the conversation because most of them are usually business owners. And I'll say, can anybody here name one business that is trying desperately to put themselves out of business? And nobody can raise their hand. Now, at the end, I'll come back and say, now do you understand why, no matter how honorable, ethical, or like minded people think they are, they have no choice but to surrender to corruption? Not that they're corrupt, it's just that they want to feed their families. I always say honest people can make $1 million, dishonest people can make 10 million.
And that's so pervasive, isn't it?
It is. It basically, I try to educate law enforcement that there is life after drugs. There is life after crime. We don't have to lay off 10 narcotics cops. We can reassign them to be traffic cops for the huge public parades and public events and sporting events that we don't have anymore because of the crime and the drugs. So don't worry about your jobs. Just worry about whether you enjoy being in narcotics or you don't care what you do as long as you're a cop.
Yeah.
Because I can hire 20 cops to do traffic control, but we don't have parades anymore. We don't have bands coming to our public parks. We don't have big social events anymore. So we better have drugs or we're not going to have any cops at all.
There's so much in there to unpack, isn't there? It doesn't get any clearer as you start digging. One of the positive things is about Leap in the UK, at least. And I know the American board, I've met the American board online, but I don't know anything about their business over there. But we've got over 400 partners because remember, it's now Law Enforcement Action Partnership. That was very clever the way they changed the name. I think they changed the name because being against something is not clever when you're campaigning. That's seen as a negative immediately.
That's right.
So I think that was the motive behind it. But it's turned out that the partnership part is exactly what we needed because we're cops, we're ex-cops, retired cops, who the penny has dropped. I made a career out of enforcing drug law, but the penny has dropped and we realise that we're the problem now rather than the solution. And that's fine, but that's the only expertise I have or any of my colleagues have, is as cops. But that partnership thing now brings in, for example, mothers against drug law who've lost children. It brings in scientists, it brings in doctors, it brings in law professionals, solicitors, and who can all see the criminal justice system, prison officers. They can see it at work, not working.
And I think that was the problem with Leap in the very beginning. It was just in the very beginning, it seemed like it was retired cops against citizens instead of law enforcement against citizens. So, like you said, renaming it and refocusing on forming a partnership was why you're evolving and why you're doing well. And getting back to my country and your country, my country, local police work under the community police, who work under the state police, who work under the federal police, who work under Washington. So, if I want to arrest a drug dealer as a police chief, the county might say, oh, no, he's bigger than you, leave him alone. And when the county wants to arrest that same drug dealer in a wide area, the state comes in and says, no, he's bigger than your county. He's throughout the state. Now, when the state wants to arrest that same drug dealer, the FBI comes in and says, no, he's in several states. He's bigger than New York. He's bigger than Pennsylvania. And then when the FBI wants to arrest him, the government comes in and says, well, wait a minute, he's dealing to the president's son and the congressman's daughter and to all these big multimillionaires. So, no.
Or the international part comes in there, where other governments and countries
That's
are
right.
involved too.
Yeah, and then the United States says, well, wait a minute, we're trying to pass NAFTA, leave Mexico drug cartels alone. And they even said to Mike Levine, he tagged all the coca manufacturing plants in Bolivia, and he was going to blow them up, which would have been about 90% of all the cocaine manufacturing in the world. And Washington said, no, Ali North and Manuel Noriega need those drug cartels to be successful. Who's going to fund the Contra affair? And they shut them down and said, don't you dare blow up those coca manufacturing plants. The citizens just aren't educated. I always say if you don't watch the news, you're uninformed. if you do watch the news, you're misinformed.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Because of the rhetoric that we're fed left, right, and centre on many, many issues, not just on this issue.
Everything.
Let me get back to that positive note again, the partnerships. And I heard a thing a wee while ago now, Mike, see what you make of this. And it was a guy who was campaigning against our laws here in the UK about trespass. It's not in Scotland, there's no trespass law in Scotland, but there is down in England. And it's to protect landowners. And this is historical. The land was divvied up between his lordships a long time ago. But they're not public spaces anymore. And this is what this guy was complaining about, that the public should be able to ramble. They should be able to take their families and have a picnic, and as long as they don't do any harm. And that's the law in Scotland, that you can go anywhere as long as you don't damage crops or fences or anything of that ilk. So he decided to take direct action. And what he did was organise the biggest picnic in the world. And he had 500,000 people turn up with their children and grandparents, and brought all their blankets and their sandwiches. And they had a massive picnic on a big, big lawn of a private estate down south. Far too much for the police to handle. And how would they handle it anyway? Because you can't manhandle children and families like you would with people protesting on the motorway or something like that. So it was a huge success, and it really brought the issue into Parliament and whatnot. And there's still stuff going on to try and change these laws, but it's big. It's a big deal. And he said, when I listened to him on the radio, that nothing has ever been changed without direct action. Direct action is always what's required to get things moving.
Things are as bad as they are because the people who can do something do nothing. And that gentleman was successful because he had how many people show up to his picnic? Can you imagine if it was just him and his partner that showed up on their private lawn?
Yeah. They'd have got arrested.
They'd still be in jail. I always said to young kids, if you're going to be a criminal, be a very successful one, because if you're not successful, you're going to go to jail for a long time. But if you're very successful, they will pay you to be a consultant so you don't teach people how to do what you did.
That's brilliant. I'm not sure where you fit in there, Mike, but that's brilliant. Let me look at that positive angle a wee bit more then, and let's project into the future. In the UK here, I don't know what's going on in the States. In fact, I do, because you're starting to, I think you've got 16 or 17 states where cannabis is now legal. And I know that the Biden administration are looking at pardons and looking at they're looking at regulation seriously, I think, for all the reasons that we've discussed and could discuss all night. That might change, of course, come November if you get a Trump government coming on board, but there's nothing we can do about that at this moment in time. But here in the UK, and this is where I think we might get some positive news, is that we're starting to wake up to the benefits of medicinal cannabis, which was legalised in 2017, I think, for medicinal purposes. But only now are we starting to see people getting certificates and being able to access legal cannabis, which is a fantastic health boon apart from anything else, because it has real benefits for people that we now know about. That aside, people are now starting to realise that there's money involved. And that changes everything. From a legal, regulated market, there might be fortunes to be made. Never mind the criminals making fortunes from the illegal market. And that might be a game changer. Is that what's happening in the States, that big business are starting to see the profits here?
Not yet, but we've come a long way since Seattle was like one of the first states to legalize. And that was a disaster. They couldn't put their money into banks. So they had, so people were robbing them and killing them because they knew all their money was buried on the property. They grew big marijuana farms, so the lazy drug users would rob them and kill them and take the pot that they worked hard to grow. It was not regulated and it was not enforced. So I don't know, in the early first year or two, how many families were killed in traffic intersections because the driver was stoned going, oh, look at the pretty red light. Drove and killed hundreds of people.
Yeah.
And the laws weren't catching up. But now It is getting more regulated. This is going to make you laugh. We have our first cannabis dispensaries in the last 2 years. I can't open one because I was never arrested for illegally using marijuana. You're only eligible you're only eligible for government free money to open a cannabis dispensary if you were once convicted of illegally or arrested for illegally using it. So,
For goodness sake, you must have experience.
unfortunately, I was never arrested for using drugs, so I'm not eligible to start a business.
For goodness sake. I should make it clear, because somebody somewhere might listen to this one day. I should make it clear that as far as LEAP are concerned, I'll be interested to hear your view on this, Mike. That what you'll know this, but I want our listeners to understand that LEAP aren't promoting legalization of all drugs. What we are promoting is decriminalisation of people that use drugs and distribute drugs, not on its own. That could never stand alone. That would just be a free for all like we have at the moment.
See, you have to have regulations and ground rules. You can't legalize fentanyl that's being used for the sole purpose of killing people. And that's where I really credit you and where LEAP has come over the last 10 or 15 years. Because 10 or 15 years ago, you would have been forbidden to speak to me, an outsider.
Of course.
So, and that's the whole idea of forming a partnership, is being inclusive to all opinions, not just the ones you want to hear.
I'll tell you something that might be heartwarming for you. We have a superintendents association through here, which is basically the leadership for Police Scotland. And it's the chief constable was there and all his minions and all his superintendents and chief superintendents. They were all at a meeting. They have one every year. And they invited us to go and speak. And I went along with a colleague, Ian Andrew. And again, we're used to being on the defensive. We're used to being on the back foot because people come out with stuff. How can you do this? How can you propose that? Cops can get quite angry about it as well because it's their livelihood that you're dealing with, because they don't see an alternative to what they're doing just now. And they've been brainwashed basically over the years. But the Superintendents Association, there was maybe 100 in the room. I'm guessing about 100. And I did the vote thing, expecting to get the 90% to back the government policy and 51 years of war on drugs and say that that's the way forward, to be better at what we already do. And none of them put a hand up, Mike. Not one thought that what we're doing is ever going to be successful, even if we threw 10 times the amount of resource at it. All we do is make the problem worse every time we intervene. And they knew that. When it came to question time, and I had to change the whole talk, Ian and I had to change. We lost about 9/10 of what we had in front of us to speak about, and we winged it because we realised that they were on our side, that they were agreeing. And the biggest debate was what we would do with the money that we didn't put into the war on drugs if we managed to turn that corner with public opinion. Let me ask you how the world would look if things keep going the way they are. Hopefully it will happen in our lifetime, Mike, but the jury's out on that. Tom Wood likened it to the death penalty a couple of weeks ago on a podcast that we did about a woman, Violet, who was campaigning back in the 60s to have the death penalty repealed. And she spent a fortune. She spent her fortune, millions, back then campaigning against the death penalty. And when it eventually was banned here in the UK, there hadn't been one for 5, 10, 15 years because public opinion was ahead of our politicians. The politicians were scared to say, okay, let's ban hanging, because they thought public opinion would go against them if they did that. And they did. None of them have ever got the balls to go against what they think's getting them voted in. But 10, 15 years down the road, with the continued pressure of Violet and the churches and all the rest of it, eventually they repealed, having not hung anyone for years because public opinion had moved. Now, let's say public opinion about drugs, which is going that way. What would the world look like if we said collectively the war on drugs has failed other than to create this monster that we now have? We call them controlled drugs here, Mike. That's what we call smack and banned substances. We call them controlled substances. And we have no control whatsoever. So let's say we did take control and we opened up cannabis retail shops and whatnot, and we made heroin and opioids and other substances available through chemists and doctors and all the outlets that we think would control them properly. And we then had control of the substances themselves and what they were and how they were taken. And we then had contact with the users and were able to influence them and change their lives. Probably that's what needs change to stop them wanting to use drugs. If all of that happened, what would happen in the criminal world? People ask me this. What are the criminals going to do if we take away that black market?
That is my strategy and how I clean up neighborhoods. When you call me and say there's a drug dealer in your neighborhood with hundreds of customers, I don't go after the drug dealer. He's got a gun. He's going to shoot me. I go after his customers. I put signs up on the street. Drug dealers on this street are police informants. Please smile and speak clearly. I put anonymous mail out saying, don't go outside this Friday night and get shot accidentally during the raid. So the customers won't come to the neighborhood. So the drug dealers have to move. Now, if every neighborhood did that, where would they move? There's two borders and two oceans. That's the only place they can go. Public opinion can change everything on this planet. It can change global warming. It can change prejudice. It can change slavery, sex slavery, trafficking. Public opinion can change everything. And the problem that we have in the United States is we're really excited about it if it's in the news for 5 days. But if it's not on the news on the 6th day, did it ever exist? We're no longer excited. It's no different than the wars. We're losing interest. We're losing interest because we don't do anything full-heartedly, and we don't do anything with full support. I did a talk. I talked to the guy was like 100 years old. He was in World War II, and he stood up and he saluted me. And I said, no, I was never in the service. He says, I don't care. When World War II, they sent us to kill people. We killed everybody until the war ended. Nobody called and said a politician doesn't like this or a group doesn't like that or we're going to pull your support. They sent us to do a job. We did the job. We got it over with and we got out of there. Today, everything takes 10 years because everybody's got an opinion. What I'm finding today in politics is the people who have the strongest opinions have not heard anything. They haven't read anything, they haven't listened to anything, and they don't know about anything. And those are the ones with the strongest opinions. And the people who do know just feel defeated.
Because it's not about what you know anymore, it's how you say it, isn't it? It's all the hype and it's all the marketing behind it. It's all the wheels that are moving behind it to put it on the stage and get it out there. What did you think of the shooting, the assassination attempt, in inverted commas, Mr. Trump?
He's not the first. He won't be the last. And, there's an old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You talk about killing people and imprisoning people and hating people. Guess what? Somebody's going to try to kill you, hate you, and imprison you. Don't complain about what you incite. Now, good presidents have been shot and killed, and good presidents have been wounded because there's always a crazy out there, or there's always some. Now, I just had a big argument on a podcast. The guy who shot Trump, they assume he's mentally deficient. They assume he's an evil person. I said, how do you know in his mind he didn't think that he was going to be a hero and save America? How do you know he wasn't thinking he was destroying tyranny from within? Why do you have to assume that he, in his mind, was an evil person? His actions weren't right. You should never shoot anybody. But why do we label him not knowing anything about him or his motives? He might have thought he was saving America democracy.
The press is so powerful now, and not just the press, but social media as well, Mike. It's an echo chamber, isn't it, for people?
Nothing worse than social media. It's all, you don't know what to believe, what not to believe. AI, artificial intelligence, you change the faces, you change the voices. Yeah, I don't know. The president could have been dead for 3 months and we would never know it because he would be appearing on TV every night.
And what's interesting, I see it on social media all the time, is everybody's got an opinion about drug law, which we're talking about tonight, and the war on drugs and legislation, and how many of them have ever been involved in arresting someone or seeing the consequences of the drug war. And I don't mean at the level we've been talking about, at the upper echelons of that marketplace where people are making millions of dollars and pounds. I'm talking about in the houses, and if you can call them that, the dwellings of people who are reliant on heroin and have a drug dependency, and their families are starving and neglected because of that dependency that's been nurtured by that marketplace. And that's where the regulation comes in, because currently, and Tom came out with this recently in one of his blogs, was about this high strength cannabis, and he sees that as a danger of decriminalisation and regulation. And what I was trying to say to him was, currently, dealers, people who are making money out of selling drugs, have absolutely no incentive to look after the health and well-being of their marketplace. They want to make profit. They want to get people hooked. They want to sell them the most hookable, addictable, and expensive drugs that they can. And that's why we need regulation.
And see, and this is where there's one thing that I say that nobody will believe, and they all look at me like I've just lost my mind. The drug dealers in the United States want a couple people to die from fentanyl because the mass drug users will say, "Oh, that kills people? I want that. That's really good stuff. Those idiots just didn't know how to use it." So when a report comes out that somebody died from drugs, the demand for that drug goes through the roof by the know-it-alls, and I know how to use it. They were just probably idiots. And the other thing, and I know we're running out of time, we not too long ago had a big newspaper headline: 7 kingpins arrested, $100,000 of cash was confiscated that weekend, and 2,800 packets of heroin was confiscated that weekend. And that was in the news, on the newspapers, all over. And I was talking to normal, average, hardworking people, and they said, "Oh, what a great job law enforcement did. What a wonderful thing happened." And I said, "No, wait a minute. If your boss fires you, how many people are going to come and apply for that job? 5, 6, 7? Well, we just announced there was 7 job openings. So there's probably 28 hardcore drug dealers can't wait to move here to get part of that $100,000 and to satisfy those 2,800 customers that didn't get service last week because they're not going without their hair."
Or had to travel elsewhere to get
Right.
service, because they didn't go without drugs, that's for sure.
We didn't announce that we did a good job. We just put out a job application to invite 20 more hardcore drug dealers to our neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen that in action time and time and time again. And one time we were so good, we set up an operation, right? I'm going back to the 80s now here in Glasgow. So this was way out on a limb, really. But we set up a drugs operation for a week. And we had a festival in Glasgow at that time called Mayfest. And it was really a wee brother of the Edinburgh Festival, not even a distant relation. But it was a cultural thing in all the pubs and clubs and whatnot in Glasgow. And alongside it, I ran Drug Fest for a week. And I had about a dozen cops involved, of a variety, policewomen and young uniform cops, and what, 2 detectives like myself. And for a week, and we'd prepared for it a couple of weeks beforehand. We had all the warrants in place, all the files in place, all the intelligence in place. And we ran amok for a week. I think we had 73 or 74 cases that week. About 8 of them serious petition cases, we would call them, but they were major cases. And at the end of the week, we had a big celebration. And on the Monday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook from other divisions in Glasgow. namely the Gorbals, which is a neighbouring division, or was a neighbouring division of mine. A friend of mine who works there said, "What on earth have you been doing? Oh, in those days we called them junkies because we didn't know any better. We had no empathy whatsoever with drug users. Like informants, they were just scum of the earth." And he was saying, every junkie from Govan is in the Gorbals now trying to score smack. And we've got dealers coming from down south to fill the gap, to bring smack up the road, because you've closed Govan. And we probably closed Govan for a day or two. That's probably what we did. But that's the dynamic. It worked. And yet I tell people that story time and time again, and the penny still doesn't drop. They still think that that's the way to win this, is to arrest our way out of it.
No, we have to regulate it seriously, not half-heartedly, and we have to have ground rules for this is legal, this is going to be condoned and supported, but this behavior is going to be still a harsh penalty. Selling drugs that kill people, selling to young kids has to be enforced, not just talked about. Mike Levine really accidentally created my plan to scare the customers. He was on a big undercover sting in New York City, huge. And he accidentally forgot to turn his PA speaker off when he was putting everybody in place for the raid. So he said, car number 1, check. Car number 2, check. It was going off on his PA speaker so the whole neighborhood could hear it. All the buyers left, and an hour later, the drug dealers were on the front porch going, what happened to all the customers? And he put that whole block out of business by accidentally announcing that they were there to conduct a raid.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I love that. That's poetic.
Now, let's close this show out. Let me just say, until you and I become 300 or more, we're not going to get a mass unbrainwashing of the public. We're not going to get the masses of citizens to take action until they hear it enough times. In any kind of publicity or marketing, you have to hear it a dozen times. You have to hear it from a dozen sources, not just two old goats that used to work undercover that agree with everything.
Well, to finish off, Tom said on our last podcast about Violet van der Elsk, who was the campaigner against capital punishment, he said that there was a lesson in there from Violet for me and for Leap Scotland, and that was that you just have to keep going. You just got to keep going. You can't afford to stop or look sideways. So I'll have a wee think about it, Mike. I'm sure there's more we can do here. We've got platforms between us, we've got platforms to do that as well. And those partnerships that I was talking about. One of the problems, and I know we are out of time now, but one of the problems is that people who start off with good intention, they start off with a charity to help people get off drugs or to get a house or get out of the situation that got them to use drugs as a crutch in the first place. And the charities does good, and they start bringing in funds, and they start treating the symptoms of the war on drugs. But it becomes a business. It becomes an income. It becomes an occupation rather than a vocation. And all of a sudden, you've got a vested interest in rehabilitation or whatever it might be, and you don't want the gravy train to end because you can draw down government funding for that kind of work too. And you can collect charitable money from foundations who want to do good and help. So all of a sudden, you're part of the problem rather than part of the
I'll
solution.
tell you how I made the best money that I ever made. When it came to addiction, I did not work with the addict. When the addict was in his $100,000 Malibu massage parlor, I worked with the family, and I did it for free. And I said, you can send him away for 6 months or 6 years. He's going to come home clean. But if you aren't educated and you are not willing to sacrifice, he'll be back on drugs in 2 weeks. And I never charged a penny, but I got the grandmothers, the grandfathers, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, the brothers and sisters all together to form a plan for rehabilitation after rehabilitation. And I got some of the biggest thank you checks that I would never have thought of charging. People who had money would give me $1,000 and thank you for saving my son's life. Thank you for educating my family. $5,000. Thank you so much. I took one guy to a funeral home that was prepping a 16-year-old girl the same age as his daughter. And I took him there and I addressed the deceased by his daughter's name. And I said, Dad didn't have time to pay attention to what you were doing. And I said to the funeral director, so how many hours do you have invested so far with the autopsy and everything? And I said, but Dad didn't have time to listen to the counselors and listen to the rest of the family because he knew it all. So how much time is it going to take to put this funeral on? And how many people are going to take time off of work to come and pay their condolences to the father who didn't have time to save your life? And he became my best friend. He wrote me a check for $5,000, thanked me. His daughter sneezes, he calls me. His daughter's friend sneezes, he calls me. And he said, I needed to have it shoved in my face. I wanted to kill you, and the only reason I didn't is because you were driving. So as long as we continue to educate, we'll get followers, and we'll have that picnic on that private grounds with 1 million people.
Thanks for that, Mike. That was fascinating, as always. Very interesting. We'll speak again, obviously. We've got some things lined up. In the meantime, get back to work. I know that you're very busy just now, and we'll speak soon, my friend. Bye-bye from Crime Time Inc.
Simon MacLean, it's Tom here from the capital speaking. How are you? Put your teeth in and come to the microphone.
I'm fantastic, Tom. Fantastic. Always good to speak to you. You always cheer me up because you make me realise how lucky we are through here in the West.
Undoubtedly, you are lucky, and you're going to be luckier because on the 25th, not far away now, we're going to have a live event down there at the Hillhead Library. Lovely venue, lovely part of Glasgow, just like Edinburgh, the leafy West End. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are going to be on your best behaviour.
I will be, Tom, despite the fact that we're expecting the beast from the east, which is yourself, of course. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And a very special guest, your friend and now my friend, Jane Hamilton.
Jane's great value because while you and I go back several millennia in the polis, Jane has a long experience as a crime writer and crime reporter, and she adds just something a little bit different. And so it's going to be very interesting to hear her views on some of the things we're talking about.
Great, Tom. Can't wait. And I can't wait to hear about your book launch that's coming up, The World's End, etc. Yeah, it's going to be good.
Yeah, let's remind people to book ahead for the 25th on our website, crimetimeinc.com, because what we don't want is a big line of people down the Byres Road, because the poor old police have had enough trouble dealing with large hostile crowds in the last couple of weeks, so let's not add to their woes, shall we?
That's a good idea, Tom. And I thought you were bringing your minders, but I've since been told that's your carers that follow you about. So that'll be a crowd of its own.
Old jokes, Simon, old jokes. Listen, one thing before, get a new script writer. Go on. It won't cost. All you need to do is another box of crackers. Just buy another box of crackers and you'll get a whole lot of new jokes. How about that?
I'll see you a week on Sunday, Tom.
Looking forward to it, Simon. You take care of yourself.
You too. Bye now.